Okay.
Okay, excellent. Hello. Welcome to everyone. It's great to have all of you joining us today for JCB Reads. I'm Karen Wolf. I'm the director and librarian of the John Carter Brown Library. And I'm so excited to be talking today to Casey Schmitt. Casey is a fantastic person in every dimension, but let me say a few things about her professional profile here, which I confessed to her already. I had been doing a little like web stalking, including reading a Ask Historians Reddit that she did back in October. I recommend it. You can look it up online. But here are some basics. So Casey is an assistant professor at Cornell University. She earned her PhD at William and Mary. Uh, she has been published in a wide variety of places, including the Hispanic American Historical Review, Early American Studies, and the William and Mary Quarterly. And of course, we're here to talk about her very recent book, The Predatory Sea. Quite exciting. Human Trafficking and Captivity in the 17th Century Caribbean. Casey's work has been supported again by a wide variety of institutions, including the Omohundro Institute and the McNeil Center, but also critically importantly, Casey was a short-term fellow at the JCB in 2017-18 and a long-term fellow here in 2022-23. Welcome, Casey.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me here and for the opportunity to talk about the book. I absolutely love this series, so it's very great and very exciting to be part of the conversation. I'm also, this is a great moment to express my gratitude to the JCB for a lot of generosity over the years. My time at the JCB was really formative, especially for this book, which, several of the key interventions that I make would not have been possible without the documents that I read at the JCB and the conversations I had with JCB staff and with my fellows. So thank you very much.
Lovely,
Um,
lovely, lovely.
I do have a PowerPoint, so I will share that.
Great. I'm going to go off screen and then we'll rejoin after your PowerPoint.
Perfect. So I wanted to take a minute to lay out the book's arguments and structure and give an example at the end that illuminates the approach that I took in writing this book. So the book traces the development and evolution of what I think of as a political economy of captive taking and human trafficking in the Greater Caribbean from, despite what the subtitle says, really the middle of the 16th century through the second half of the 17th century. I argue in the book that over this century of Caribbean history, practices of seizing individuals through maritime and coastal raids were widespread, and that the subsequent trafficking of those individuals into captivity shaped the development of English and French Caribbean colonies. So the book begins in the 1560s when multinational crews of privately financed Northern European ships sailed throughout the Spanish Caribbean, the sort of region on the map here, in order to do what they called making a voyage through raiding and smuggling. Now, that language of making a voyage is common in the English, French, and Spanish sources of the era, and it captures really well the process of coastal foraging and violence that shaped Northern European interactions in the region for half a century. As I show in the first chapter of the book, Northern European traffickers made their voyages through smuggling with Spanish Caribbean populations for hides, tobacco, dyewoods, and other products from the region. Now, crucially, Northern Europeans found local residents more eager for trade, and I should note, of course, that this trade was considered smuggling and deemed illegal by Spanish imperial authorities. Anyway, Northern Europeans generally found residents in the Spanish Caribbean more willing to trade when they had enslaved captive people to exchange for island produce. And while there are many famous examples like John Hawkins that show how Northern Europeans entered the transatlantic slave trade beginning in the 1560s, my archival research revealed that the more common method, or at least a common method, of trafficking people into slavery through illicit trade involved seizing captives through maritime raids on Portuguese transatlantic slaving vessels or by raiding coastal communities throughout the Greater Caribbean all the way down to Brazil. So, for example, a common practice deployed by Northern European traffickers involved raiding along the Spanish Main and then sailing to commercially underserved Spanish Caribbean islands such as Puerto Rico or parts of Hispaniola to traffic those captives into slavery. As I show in the book in detail, this political economy of captive taking and human trafficking meant that often people who were trafficked into slavery had been legally free before their captivity. Several examples in the book itself look at how captives attempted and in some cases succeeded to regain their freedom. Now, in order to engage in this violent trade, Northern European traffickers often spent extended periods of time in the Caribbean. As I argue in the book, in the era before official English, French, or Dutch colonies, this required secure maritime bases where crews could careen their vessels and restock provisions of wood and water. Now, these spaces where they engaged in these activities, careened their vessels, evolved into the earliest English and French colonies in the Caribbean, beginning with the island of St. Christopher that you can see off in the right side of that map. This is Saint Christophe or present-day St. Kitts. Now, survival in the early Caribbean depended, as I show in the first 3 chapters of the book, on cross-cultural alliances with the Kalinago of the Lesser Antilles, Maroon communities in places like Western Hispaniola, and trade alliances with commercially underserved Spanish Caribbean populations in places like southern Puerto Rico. By the 1620s and 1630s, as colonial promoters in England and France began sponsoring colonies in the Caribbean, those alliances that were key to sort of Northern European survival in this region started to shift, and populations who used to trade with Northern European traffickers found themselves instead by the 1630s at the center of this violent raiding and captive taking process. Now, the role of the earliest colonies in networks of raiding and human trafficking is clearest with St. Christopher, where one of the first French governors, Pierre Blanc de Nambu, had a career as a ship captain engaged in extensive human trafficking before becoming a royal governor. Now, both he and the English governor of the shared island, Thomas Warner, allowed traffickers to continue to use St. Christopher as a maritime base and to traffic captives into slavery there. As I show in the book, the earliest treaties signed between the island's governors included provisions for controlling the movement of enslaved people, making it one of the earliest legal references to slavery in the Anglo or Franco-Caribbean. In other words, the island developed into a colony because of its role as a maritime base for human traffickers, and as a result of continuing to occupy that role even after it became an official colony, island residents exploited enslaved labor there from the very beginning. Now, one of the consequences of all of this raiding, captive taking, and human trafficking was a series of Spanish attacks on insular nodes in this violent political economy. I show in the book how between 1629 and 1653, Spain authorized 7 different invasions of St. Christopher, Tortuga, and Providencia. Now, Spanish forces in each case had received intelligence from African and indigenous descended captives who escaped from these English and French colonies to Spanish territories and gave testimonies about everything they had seen and heard while enslaved in those spaces. In chapter 4 of the book, I argue that captives were cause and consequence of imperial warfare in this violent mid-century moment. Now, the second half of the book then traces this inter-imperial violence through the experiences of captives and their captors, ending with a discussion of various attempts to formalize the intra-Caribbean, inter-imperial slave trade, especially through the Grillo and Lomelin Asiento in the 1660s and 1670s. Now, I want to turn now to a brief example that I hope will illuminate my approach in writing this book and sort of recounting this history that I just sketched out. The example comes from a single family whose experiences I pieced together from a variety of archival sources and who can help, I think, shed light on what this world meant for the people who experienced it. So, sometime in the 1630s, a woman named Catalina de Angola had been taken captive and trafficked into slavery on Providencia, called Providence Island by the English. She labored on that English island until 1641, when a Spanish invasion force retook the island from the English. Now, the Spanish invasion force sold some of the people who had been taken during the invasion, but women of African descent like Catalina were placed in the homes of Spanish soldiers tasked with manning the new presidio. Catalina found herself laboring in the home of the Presidio's captain, Salvador de la Peña, and over the next 5 years, she bore him 3 children, 2 little girls and a son named after his father. Now, the son, Salvador Francisco de la Peña, was only a year old when his father petitioned to purchase him, his sisters, and his mother out of slavery. Now, his father's desire to legally free his small family resonated with many other Afro-Iberian families on the island. Over the previous 5 years, so since the invasion, as I show in the book, many of the men stationed there had formed families with the Afro-descended women who had been taken from the English during the 1641 invasion. These women, like Catalina, had experienced multiple moments of violent dislocation in the Caribbean, including at the hands of Northern European traffickers who had taken them captive and sold them into slavery among the English on Providencia. Now, by the time Salvador Francisco had been born, however, women of African descent had formed effective and familial ties with Iberian men, securing a pathway to legal freedom for themselves and their children. Those pathways, as I show in the book, however, were cut short by Edward Mansfeld and Henry Morgan's 1666 raid on Spanish Providencia. During that raid, Salvador Francisco and others were taken captive and sold into slavery in English Jamaica. So, despite the efforts of his mother and father, the legal freedom bestowed on Salvador Francisco shortly after his birth did little to protect him from slavery once he was forcibly removed from his community of belonging and trafficked across imperial borders. Now, crucially, Salvador Francisco escaped with a group of people from English Jamaica to Spanish Cuba, where he and his companions faced legal questions about their statuses driven by changes to the intra-Caribbean slave trade. Now, I close with this multi-generational experience of captivity, human trafficking, and self-liberation in order to emphasize the ways in which the book analyzes this political economy of captive taking and human trafficking over a century of Caribbean history through the experiences of individuals who are really at the center of this story. So thinking about this multi-generational experience of captivity, I think really allows us to think about the vulnerability inherent in the political economy that I discuss in the book. I will leave it there, and I'm looking forward to the questions.
Thank you so much, Casey. This is such a rich and fascinating work and reflects so much extraordinary research. And I know that every time I talk about this work with anyone, the kind of general sense is that the care and nuance and detail that you bring to this is so extraordinary. And you share with us this incredible story of this multi-generational family, but what it required in order to understand the context for this multi-generational family in this unbelievably complex setting and sequence of events is quite remarkable. So congratulations, really. It's quite something. Okay, so as you know, we always ask the same 6 questions to folks who appear in this, and I'll try not to jump in with too many extras, but we wondered if you could talk about the origins of this project. How did it start, and then how did it develop? Like, what's the origin story here?
Yeah, thank you. It, the origin of the book is many false starts, I think is what I'll say. It started as a project. I was very interested in questions of legal borrowing in the Caribbean. You know, I was interested in how much Spanish practices of slavery may have influenced English or French adoption of slavery in the Caribbean. I went to both England and France to do archival research based around that question, looking for sources from the 1630s, potentially earlier. And I actually found very little. I was very discouraged. I thought I would have to sort of reconceptualize the project entirely. And then I went to the Spanish archives and discovered a sort of unbelievable wealth of the kinds of testimonies that came from captives who had escaped captivity, Northern European mariners who themselves had been taken captive while raiding or attempting to smuggle. And I spent a long time struggling to square what was being described in those sources with the historiography, rather than a sort of gradual adoption of slavery alongside the plantation complex. I saw this sort of informal, immediate engagement with both trade and the exploitation of enslaved labor. And so the book sort of evolved after a manuscript workshop. I received a lot of really great feedback from people who had read the dissertation, who encouraged me to sort of drop the legal history aspect and instead lean into just telling the history that I was uncovering in those Spanish sources. So the process that was so formative at the JCB, in fact, was then going back through and thinking about how to write this not as a legal history, but instead as a kind of social history that is both inter-imperial and multinational and sort of spans a century of Caribbean history, that takes seriously what they were describing and not what I think often historians expect to find in these sources, that sort of matches the narrative that tends to read the development of the plantation complex back into the 17th century and looks for origins of that plantation complex in the 17th century. I had to sort of kind of bracket what I knew the Caribbean would become and instead focus on what was being described in these sources.
Mm. I always wonder whether that is, we all suffer from the century that is distorting the history that we want to tell. I say that all the time about the 19th century. It messes up the 18th century completely and it ruins what we think we want to learn about it. But it does seem like there is something really particular about what you were describing, wanting to have to do a kind of prehistory of something that you assumed, and yet it looked completely different. Was there like a moment where you thought, I can't do it this way?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, sort of in some ways throughout the process, especially when I was trying to write it as a legal history, because essentially what kept happening is I would read about people's experiences that did not match what should have happened to them according to different imperial laws. So there was one case in particular, which is one of the only cases that sort of stayed from the dissertation kind of almost unchanged into the book. And it's this case of Francisco da Costa, who's a Afro-Portuguese mariner who gets taken captive off the coast of Brazil. He ends up being sold into slavery to the French governor of Tortuga. He escapes. But when he escapes, he ends up in Spanish territory and sold at public auction into slavery. And the only explanation as to why, in the sort of notary's hand and the side of this testimony, it just says, because he seems like a slave. And it was, and so that was one of those cases that when I was first writing the dissertation, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out legally, why is that the case? What are the decisions that are being made here? Is this a precedent for something else? Are there other cases like this? And so I ended up in some ways writing kind of in circles to try to
Mm-hmm.
explain why his experience did not fit what we expected to find, or what I at least expected to have happened to him. And so that was one of the early cases that made me feel like I'm spending a lot of time explaining why this doesn't fit what we think we know, instead of reading it as this should inform how we think about this world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's so great. Thank you. Um, that actually, I think, leads into this next question about um, what kinds of contribution you want to make or wanted to make to the scholarship. We're always in conversation with those people whose work we've read. Sometimes they're buzzing around in our head. Sometimes they're really loud. Sometimes, in fact, they're making us think that we should see things that we're not seeing. Sometimes they make it harder to see what's right in front of us. Are there ways that, I guess I'm asking you straightforwardly a question about what scholarly conversations do you want to be involved in and do you want to contribute to? But also, how did that change as your conception of the work that you were doing changed?
Yeah, it's a great question. I will say, for this work, and I think it's true for all of us, but it's particularly true, I think, when you work between a lot of different historiographies, you become very indebted to the people who are experts in particular areas and really build off of them. And I was very, very lucky that around the moment that I was starting to reconceptualize how I wanted this book to be written, there was just a ton of books that were published that were taking this kind of multi-imperial approach to the Caribbean. So Jennifer Wolfe wrote an absolutely amazing book on on Puerto Rico in this period, Isla Atlantica, Puerto Rico, and it's just this phenomenal study that situates Puerto Rico within these kinds of smuggling networks and inter-imperial trade networks in a moment in the historiography where Puerto Rico is normally described as being a commercial backwater and sort of ignored. And she's sort of saying, instead, if you look at illicit trade networks, it's anything but,
Mm, mm,
Juan Jose Ponce Vasquez's book, Islanders and Empire, had come out while I was reconceptualizing this. Tessa Murphy's book, Creole Archipelago, really helped me sort of think about situating this history from the experiences of the people who lived it. How
mm,
do you write a kind of trans-imperial history, not from the perspective of empires, but instead from the perspective of people who make their lives often in the spaces between empires.
mm,
So there was a huge historiography that really helped me get this project off the ground and help me think about it in a really critical way. It just wouldn't have been possible without.
mm, mm. I'm wondering about just your mention of Tessa's book makes me ask a kind of additional question here too, which is if you could talk a little bit about how you think about Indigenous people of the Caribbean and the role of Indigenous people of the Caribbean in this kind of set of processes you see activated in this earlier period.
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, really work that Tessa kind of pioneered and had us all thinking about. I've been lucky to work with Ernesto Mercado Montero, who's also doing really exciting work about the Kalinago in particular. In my own work, what became very clear to me was how absolutely dependent Northern European traffickers were on finding anchorages that would protect them from Spanish reprisal, where they could access food and wood and water easily, especially because this coastal foraging often had Northern European vessels in the Caribbean for extended periods of time,
Mm,
right?
hmm
And in the Caribbean, this means, of course, that ship hulls would deteriorate. There were mollusks
hmm
and different things that would eat away at the hull of vessels. So careening had to be done every 6 months, and it's a process that left a ship completely immobile for a period of time, right? So it's a very sort of dangerous, vulnerable moment
mm.
for a ship crew
They're
that
totally
is
denuded.
engaged in,
Yes.
violent activities in the Caribbean.
Mm,
And so I found this reliance on the Kalinago incredibly interesting, and the ways in which the Kalinago used trade with Northern Europeans to undergird their sovereignty in the region, it sort of enabled them to keep portions of the Lesser Antilles as their sort of sphere against, Spanish slave raiding. And so thinking about that vulnerability, but also the ways in which indigenous populations used what would be considered, smuggling, contraband trade, these sorts of things as a form of resistance, right? As a
mm,
form of resisting colonization and slave raiding. But then, crucially, the ways in which this shifts once Northern Europeans have their own official colonies in the Caribbean. So
Hmm.
once once traffickers are less dependent on these kind of autonomous enclaves for things like careening and accessing supplies, the nature of the maritime violence starts to change. And so people who used to be trade partners now become sort of vulnerable to raiding and captivity.
I love that. Well, not love, obviously. We don't love the violence there. But what I appreciate, let's try this. What I appreciate is the way that you describe how the same cast of characters can be simultaneously like extraordinarily violent actors and also be vulnerable people who are acted upon violently. And like the layers of complexity here leave us both thinking, I think, both that we misunderstood kind of the origins. Is there an origin? Is there an origin of slaving? We've misunderstood the origin of slaving in the Americas in some way. And also, we misunderstand the clearest distinctions between the kind of protagonist antagonist relationship. And yeah, that's a lot of complexity. Casey.
Yeah, and I think part of it though too is you know, thinking about antecedents to slavery and the origin of slavery. I mean, I think this is a really interesting question and one that I grapple with in the book as much as I can. And what was fascinating to me is the questions around vulnerability and racialization. And this is where, thinking about populations as being, especially Afro-descended populations as being vulnerable to the potential of enslavement, but
Mm-hmm.
not always. And so thinking about the sort of, again, the dependence of Northern European traffickers on populations for trade and careening in the period before the 1630s meant that, one of the individuals who I mentioned in my introduction, Pierre Blanc de Nembu, he spends a significant amount of time on the island of Caimito in Western Hispaniola, trading with Afro-descended maroon communities without taking them captive, right? And so, sort of thinking about sort of the vulnerability and exploitation being tied to this political economy, that it's not a
Mm-hmm.
simple question of when does slavery become racialized, and instead becomes how I began to think about it operating in this world is essentially this question of vulnerability. When and where and how does a person become vulnerable to slavery? And what are the possibilities, what are the mechanisms that prevent them from being vulnerable
Mm-hmm.
to enslavement?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Um, so I know we're going to have some questions pop up, and thank all of you for adding questions. We're going to come to those in just a moment. Casey, I want to ask you about some of the most surprising things you came across in your research. I already kind of tipped my hand with that question, but I wanted to give you another go at that because I think all of us who work in archival materials have these moments of surprise or sometimes shock, dismay, even anger as we work through the archival materials. And I wondered if you wanted to share some of that with us.
Yeah, thank you. I think probably the the most surprising, painful, in fact, thing that among the most surprising and painful things I read in the archives is actually around Salvador Francisco, the son of Catalina. I had actually come across him first in the testimonies that were given in Cuba after he had escaped as an adult.
Yeah.
And he described being from Providencia. He escapes with a large group of people. April Hatfield also talks about this case in her recent book. And I got very interested in the number of people who had escaped from Providencia. I hadn't actually done that much poking around in Providencia. I went back to the archives after about a year away and I started looking for traces of him. And the first day in the archive, the first set of folders that I had called up, in fact, contained his father's petition to purchase him and his mother and his sisters out of slavery. And it was a really difficult thing to read. It's actually an incredibly touching letter where he's sort of talking about not necessarily being able to afford to purchase them, but wanting to, and sort of how this would help the Presidio. He words it in language that I think Lauren Benton would appreciate from the way she talks about Presidio family formation. And but he words it in this very emotional, compelling way. And reading that after knowing what happened to Salvador Francisco was, I think, a sort of really kind of painful reminder of, despite the fact that he had liberated himself from slavery in English Jamaica, it's not at all clear to me that he ever made it back to Providencia. Right. And so thinking about, the kinds of serial dislocations that really shaped people's experiences in this world was tough to grapple with.
Yeah, you've got a lot of people who are moving around. I mean, for the people that you're able to articulate for us, sometimes they're moving around a lot. Do you think part of that is the archival material that, like, you locate them? I always wonder about that in my own very different research. But like, if I've got three scraps about somebody, does that mean that everybody experienced the same three things that the person that I've, located has? Like, is this an archival thing, or can you tell us more about like just how mobile, or I guess, yeah, mobile these populations are, sometimes push, sometimes pull, across this particular Caribbean seascape?
Yeah, it's a great question. And of course, for the 16th and 17th century Caribbean, you're dependent on what sources remain. And you're right to point out that, in fact, these are sources that are going to prioritize mobile people, right? So the majority of my source base came from testimonies of individuals, as I said, who had escaped captivity or were traffickers themselves and taken captive during attempts at smuggling. However, there is a lot of really great research that points to this not being as isolated of an experience as the scraps of paper, sort of, you might think, right? Just because I have access to these people. So John Thornton has written extensively about the numbers in the 1630s and 1640s. Alison Games' article, which I absolutely love, on Providence Island, similarly points to the kinds of numbers of people who are being taken captive in this world. The qualitative aspects of the voices that I can access in the archives are singular because their voices have been preserved. But Greg O'Malley also has really great information on this in the first chapters of his book, that this qualitatively was a common experience, right? The kind of vulnerability and mobility was really widespread especially the early 17th century.
Thank you. So I guess then the next question is totally JCB centric question, but can you tell us about at least one of the most important sources that you used here at the library?
Yes, yes. And actually, and I'm not just saying this because I was a fellow multiple times and because I'm talking to the director, but a document that I read at the JCB, in fact, is the document that I used to introduce the book. And it is a document that describes Dennembu's trafficking in Western Hispaniola. And it's a fascinating document, especially because it comes from, so he's in Western Hispaniola. The governor of Cartagena sends several vessels to intercept him and to sort of disrupt the trade that he's conducting in Western Hispaniola. And there's a whole description of the kind of base that he sets up at Caimito. They had constructed a forge, they had, built houses. And so it spoke to the nature of how peaceful these trade relations were, how much time he was anticipating on spending at this maritime base, and then also the nature of that trade. So he had taken Afro-descended captives from the Spanish Main and smuggled several of them into slavery in Western Hispaniola. And so it was a document that I had known him, of course, as the first French governor of St. Christopher, of St. Christophe. And I had known, there had been references to his activities as either a corsair or a pirate before he became a royal governor. And it was reading that document that it just sort of really sunk in that this is the guy guy who then goes to St. Christopher and immediately signs a treaty with his English counterpart, controlling the movement of enslaved labor, right? So he had entered Caribbean colonization, I think, with a clear sense of what was going to make the island profitable based off of the business that he'd been engaged in the Western Caribbean. And that document was, I sort of came across it at the JCB, and it made the introduction of the book. So
Thank you. Obviously, we're so delighted to be able to support the complex kind of work that you're doing and the JCB's focus on a full kind of hemispheric history, and of course the rich multilingual sources that are here. We're so proud of that anyway, and on display every week with our fellow seminars. Can you tell us a little bit about what you might be working on now? And then I'm going to go to a couple of questions that have come in, and then we'll wait for the reading question till the end.
okay, perfect. Yeah, so I'm working on two projects right now. One builds directly off of this, and it comes from a case later from the 1680s that involves Bartholomew Sharp and this sort of voyage of rampaging and raiding in the Pacific world that traces, in fact, similarly the experiences of captives who, rather than being sold into the Caribbean, are taken back to London, in fact, and use their time in London to escape to the Spanish ambassador and demand that Sharp be put on trial. And so I'm writing a sort of hopefully more classroom accessible history that grapples with similar questions of captivity and trafficking and vulnerability, but through a single voyage. And in fact, for those who are interested in piracy and pirate historiography, a very famous voyage. The second project is actually a sort of history that points more towards early America and early North America, and will likely take much longer to write. But it's a book that is essentially tries to position Puerto Rico and specifically the island of Mona within early colonization. So I look at the ways in which Jamestown, Roanoke, Quebec, these were all voyages that all attempts at colonization that were deeply dependent on trade ties with Puerto Rico, and specifically, weirdly, this very small island called Mona between Puerto Rico and Hispaniola that served as a kind of a breadbasket for Puerto Rico that then becomes deeply involved in smuggling with Northern European attempts to colonize in North America. So that one is sort of kind of trying to imagine North American colonization from the perspective of not just the Caribbean, but also the South Atlantic.
Oh, those both sound great. And I mean, there's not a day that goes by that I don't think if more people understood the depth and breadth of the historical context, we'd all be better off. Anyway, in both those cases, I thought, well, those would be really dead useful for some conversations that are happening right in this moment. Anyway, thank you. Thank you for those. All right, I'm going to go to two questions that have come in. A question from David. I'm just going to read them out to you, Casey. This work sounds awesome. Thank you for sharing a glimpse of the primary source material, interest in the law regime, and profit motive operating at the same time. Indeed. Could you dive into that a little bit? As I understand, the Spanish new laws were on the books, so to speak, already, and I suppose perhaps the human traffickers are aware of this and operate or adjust practices to extract profits from bodies and labor. So, can you talk about that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And it's sort of, I think it points to some of the false starts from the early part of the project. I think what I had encountered in the archival evidence is less a sort of nuanced attention to legal regimes and more a contraband trade in which access to coerced labor really sort of greased the wheels of this contraband trade. Greg O'Malley has this great quote in his book where he describes it as the next best thing to coin, right? That this became a sort of driving engine for the contraband trade. That then, of course, individuals who are smuggled into places like San German in southern Puerto Rico or Western Hispaniola are also far-ish away from imperial officials. So there is this way in which this sort of contraband economy is functioning outside of the orbit of these kind of imperial regulations of who can and cannot be enslaved. What comes up the most, of course, is the paying of taxes on captives who are trafficked into the Spanish Caribbean. And there's some really great work. David Wheat and Mark Eagle have worked on arribadas, so the illicit Portuguese trade to the Spanish Caribbean. And I see this trade being conducted by Northern European traffickers as functioning similarly to what they described, right? Islanders and Empire also gets into this. So this is very, very much embedded in an illicit economy. And when there are legal cases about the sort of trafficked individuals, it usually comes about because of the paying of taxes, right? So in the Spanish Caribbean in the 17th century, anyone who denounced smugglers would often get a third of the profit of the goods that had been smuggled. And so what you start to see, and Juan Ponce Vasquez does a really good job describing this process as well, what you see are the kind of like internal politics of the island playing out, where someone will denounce someone often because of local political concerns and sometimes less because of the legality of this trade. But I hope that answers the question. This is very
Yeah.
much something that's embedded in an
Yeah.
illicit economy.
Yeah. That instrumental inseparability of law and economic profit motive. Yeah. So good. Thank you. Okay. Question from Tiago. Hi, Casey. Great presentation. I already started reading your amazing book. Looking forward to the break so I can finish it. We're all looking forward to like the break for finishing books. I'm 100% confident of that. Would love for you to talk about working with multiple historiographies. It feels like your main goal is to contribute to the English Atlantic debates, but how do you think your work contributes to debates on the Spanish and French Atlantics? I think you've gestured at this, but maybe bringing that out a little bit more. And by doing so, contributing to the more integrated and less imperial view of the Atlantic world.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And thank you for reading the book. I'm excited to hear your thoughts. I hope we can catch up at some point. Yeah, you know, my goal in this book was really to speak to English and French Atlantic historiography, and it was really to highlight the possibilities for doing what I refer to in the introduction. I call it a sort of entangled archival methodology. Whether that works or not as a phrase, I don't know. But what I wanted to show was the possibility for working in areas where the English and French archives are just less robust. You know, anything before 1660 in the English and French archives are very thin, right? Becomes a very difficult period to study from those specific archives. And I wanted to highlight in this book how much can be gained by looking at the Spanish archives, right? And how much we can access about the lived experience of the early English and French Caribbean that we really don't have access to in those archives at all. And I also wanted to, you know, as I said earlier, sort of build on the work of people like Tessa Murphy to kind of think about the 16th and 17th century Caribbean not as a kind of imperial space. There's a part of the book where I talk about those series of invasions of the different islands, Tortuga and St. Christopher and Providencia between 1629 and 1653. And historians have talked about these invasions, of course, but they tend to talk about them through the perspective of sort of imperial aims and imperial objectives, which means that they're sort of, in some ways, kind of talked about as almost chess pieces, right? Islands are lost and gained, and it has to do with this kind of inter-imperial competition. And what I wanted to do with the book instead was to emphasize what happens to people who are on these islands, right? Like what happens to captives. So one of the discussions of the invasion of Tortuga, in fact, involved the Spanish invasion force from Hispaniola took Afro-descended captives from Tortuga and sold them into slavery to recoup the expenses of that invasion. And it's something that, of course, Spanish Caribbean historiography has talked about Tortuga and piracy and the Spanish invasion of this piratical island, but there'd been less emphasis on how it was funded, what happened to the people who were taken captive. So I see this as sort of trying to continue a conversation that other scholars have started of thinking of this space outside of the boundaries of empire, which I guess in some way that then means outside of these kind of historiographical silos that we tend to work
Yeah,
in based off
yeah.
of linguistic and national framings.
And archival institutions. Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, I think that's such a powerful point about these archival institutions have followed the national and imperial boundaries, and historiographies have replicated that. And yeah,
Yeah.
it's really such a great point. Okay, Gabrielle. Hello, Gabrielle. Congratulations, Casey, on this important achievement, having worked across all these archives. Can you reflect on how differently the voices of enslaved and subaltern individuals surface in Spanish versus French or English sources? And to what extent does the history you trace in the book help explain those differences?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for those kind words. I should have also mentioned Gabrielle has an absolutely incredible chapter on the Maroon communities in Western Hispaniola that I build from extensively. So
Mm,
thank you so much for that work. So it's a great question, and I think I engage in the archival silences debate a little bit in the conclusion of the book because I think there is a tendency, when you're writing on the history of slavery, there is more that we can't know than we can know, but is there are opportunities to access the experiences of enslaved people, again, in this early English and French Caribbean moment through Spanish archives that is just not possible in English and French archival sources
mm,
that I know of. If I'm
mm,
wrong, I would love to hear it, but the sorts of testimonies that I was able to access of individuals who had spent, in some cases, years enslaved among either the English or the French, in which they are asked to describe their experiences, to describe what they had seen and experienced in this space. It's a really sort of rare window onto the early English and French Caribbean. Like I
mm,
said, that just isn't possible from those other sources. And they have to be, of course, all of these testimonies, I think, as Karen had mentioned earlier, with, how representative are these? You have people who are very mobile. They have to be read very critically, but these testimonies were taken in large part for geopolitical reasons, right? The Spanish who are interrogating them actually want to know exactly how many people are on the island. What are they doing to make money? What are they producing? What do the plantations look like? What did you see while you were there? Who did you
mm,
know? And that sort of detail I found as I was reading it after having experienced the English and French archives, which tended to be a little bit more top down, a little bit more from the perspective of governors sending letters back to, financiers and investors. I found the sort of access to lived experience in the Spanish archives just absolutely incredible. This is
mm,
something that Kristen Block also has talked a lot about in her first book about, what you can access from these archives that isn't possible otherwise.
mm. Thank you. That's great. Okay, question from Betsy. Being centered in southern New England, herself, that is, I'm curious whether your research uncovered Indigenous people trafficked from this region, especially following the Pequot War, when we know Indigenous prisoners were exchanged in the Caribbean for enslaved African people.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I do wish I had had time to do more of that kind of research. Linford Fisher's new book, I think, is going to do a lot, build on his articles on this and do a lot more with that. Yes.
There's a little product placement. My desk is full of product placement.
That will be a great resource for this. What I did find, however, were many instances of captives from the Caribbean being trafficked into North America. So not just the 1619 captives being trafficked into Point Comfort, Virginia, but in fact this being a much more common occurrence. So after the English invasion of Jamaica, many of the Afro-descended people taken captive off of Jamaica were trafficked into slavery in Virginia. I also encountered, from a New England perspective, people who, for New England historians, you might be more familiar with, who show up in the Caribbean in interesting ways. So John Stone, whose murder sort of sparks the Pequot War, is in fact a really well-known trafficker in the Caribbean. He's involved in several instances of trafficking captives to Puerto Rico, including one instance in which he is in charge of sort of returning Portuguese sailors who had been seized off of a Portuguese transatlantic slave ship to Puerto Rico. And that's where he was right before he returns to New England and has that encounter with the Pequots. So there are ties there. I spent a lot more of the book focused on what this meant in the greater Caribbean, but there are sort of references to how interconnected this world is to North America.
Well, and I couldn't help but hear in your description of that first of your that second of your new projects that, bringing Jamestown, Quebec, and Puerto Rico into the same frame will necessarily, brings New England in there too with that early 17th century. Love that. Okay, Jesse Cromwell says, thank you for the chat, Casey. The Predatory Sea, first on my post-semester to read shelf. See, I know we're all on this, like everybody's got their book bags packed. Today, you seem to be describing a world that almost defies law and legal precedent. Afro-descended peoples were deeply vulnerable to captivity almost regardless of their current legal status in a given empire. And a lot of this has to do with the deeply volatile nature of the 17th century Caribbean, and you practically can't read a source about piracy without hearing sidebars about Africans captured and sold. That's parenthetical. Do you think there's a period where law more fully solidifies between empires in terms of acknowledging respective legal status of Afro-descended people? And if so, what are the turning points for this? The decline of state-sanctioned piracy, acknowledgement of English, French, and Dutch possessions, or something else?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for this question, Jesse. In the book, I think the biggest pivot point that I try to emphasize is, in fact, the Grillo and Lomelin Asiento. And this is sort of insider Caribbean baseball, but it is essentially a new Asiento contract. So the legal contract to sell enslaved Africans in Spanish America gets issued to a pair of Genoese merchants. And it's a completely different sort of Asiento contract in which, rather than conducting the transatlantic portion of the slave trade, the Genoese merchants are allowed to subcontract that from English and Dutch and eventually French merchant companies. And so what this sparks, and this is tied to this question of sort of the decline of state sponsorship of piracy, what this sparks is, in fact, a need to sort of formalize the chaotic and violent nature of the intra-Caribbean slave trade in the period before 1660. So Holly Brewer has done some work to talk about the role of the Stuart monarchy in really pushing this, the formalization of the trade and the Royal African Company. And I don't talk about that as much in the book, but I do talk about the ways in which local governors in the Caribbean become factors of the slave trading monopoly companies. And every time there's sort of acts of violence and the seizing of captives and raiding, it disrupts, in fact, the trade. And there's a deep, especially in the Lesser Antilles, competition between the Dutch and the English for access to this trade. And so there is a kind of the islands that I describe as being central nodes in this violent, illicit trade, beginning, really quite early in the late 16th century, end up becoming central nodes in the legal formalized trade, which in some ways then incentivizes less violent acts of captive taking and human trafficking. So I see that sort of the debates about, the attempts to formalize that trade as being sort of the central pivot that changes the world that I describe. And it comes also with a lot more diplomacy between governors within the Caribbean. So the English and Dutch and French governors of the Lesser Antilles are now attempting to arrange trade relations with the governor of Puerto Rico, with the governor of Hispaniola, So you see much more of a kind of attempt to create a diplomatic zone of trade that, of course, like the kind of violent trade that I was describing from earlier, works at cross purposes. In the Lesser Antilles itself, actually, starting in the 1660s, English, French, and Dutch governors sign among each other treaties of rendition. So treaties in which if enslaved people escape from one island to another, they have agreed to return them. So even the kinds of mobility that I describe for people who self-liberate in this world starts to kind of be foreclosed in certain ways. And so I think it's this attempt to formalize the trade on the part of state-sponsored monopoly companies that really kind of clamps down on this world. But of course, I say in the conclusion, there is no neat endpoint, right? The taking of captives and trafficking them into slavery or into some kind of coerced labor really doesn't end at any point. But the nature of what I described in the beginning of the book really, to me, sort of felt like it had fundamentally changed by the 1670s.
Thank you. Okay, last question from Lou. Hi, Casey. Very interesting book. Congratulations. And two questions. Okay, this is two in one. One, to what degree did this predatory Caribbean Sea, by the way, this is a sidebar for me. I just love the title. Predatory Sea is so evocative. Like you get it right there. It's just fantastic. Did this predatory Caribbean Sea relate to similar activity in the Gulf of Guinea, aka the Bight, and even beyond the Atlantic world? And two, did then the commodification of enslaved people arise in Africa in accordance with the nature of the traffic there?
Okay, yes, thank you. Thank you so much for that question, Lou. Yes, it is something that is beyond the nature of what I had looked at. Although I did do quite a bit of reading, of course, on the raiding on Portuguese transatlantic slaving vessels. And so the kind of maritime violence that I describe occurring in the Caribbean world happened all across the Atlantic, including in Atlantic Africa. But it's not something that I necessarily spent that much time researching for this book. It is something that I hope, however, becomes an area of future research, because I too would be very interested in thinking about the connections between how exactly the trade is happening, how much captive taking is happening in Atlantic Africa. This is also, I would love to see in the future more work on Brazil and the Southern Atlantic in this world. Incredible number of people who I describe in the book had actually been taken captive in Portuguese Brazil. And so how exactly is the South Atlantic working, right? How is the sort of transatlantic side of this story functioning is something that I would actually also really love to see.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Okay, so the last question, Casey, is what are you reading now? And I know actually she's reading all of your books. Let's just stipulate to that, right? But Casey, what are you reading now?
So I'm like everybody else. Currently, I am reading student essays and exams. But as soon as the semester ends, I'm in one of these very lucky positions in which a lot of the friends that I had gone to graduate school with are all publishing their books right now. And so, top on my list for immediately after break is Jordan Smith's Invention of Rum and Jack Bouchard's Terra Nova. These are two books that I'm really looking forward to. I'm also very late getting to Catherine Hall's Lucky Valley, which I'm also very much looking forward to. I am also very excited to read Karen Wolf's new book.
All right, that's some very good
Okay,
product placement there, Casey.
that's it.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yes.
That's very good. Okay, well, thank you for this wonderful conversation. It's fantastic to see you. Congratulations again on the
Thank
book.
you.
Cornell University Press. I'm pretty sure the press might have a nice author discount. Do you have a discount code
Yeah.
for us,
Yes,
Casey, by
and
chance?
it's University of Pennsylvania Press.
Oh my God, I
Uh,
knew this. You teach at Cornell. I knew this. It says
no,
Penn right there. And I
yeah.
knew this. Right. Penn. Penn has a discount code for the book. I'm sure of
Yes,
it. Yes.
it is the holiday sale right now. So,
Very nice. Okay. All right. So you can find it on Penn's website. Excellent. All right. Thank you. And thank you all. And we hope to see many of you back here again for JCB Reads in the spring.
thank you.
Take care.